The lobby of Sterling Dominion's headquarters was the kind of place that made people aware of their own shoes. Marble floors, crystal chandeliers, men in tailored suits who had learned long ago how to look at someone and decide in 3 seconds whether they belonged. Clara Hayes did not belong. At least that was what every polished surface seemed to reflect back at her. 36 years old, wearing a coat that had survived 2 winters too many, clutching a thick folder of documents against her chest. Her 8-year-old daughter Lily pressed close to her side. She hadn't made it 10 steps past the entrance when Martin Vale stepped out of the crowd. Her ex-husband, Senior Operations Director of Sterling Dominion. He didn't lower his voice. He wanted to be heard. "You don't belong here, Clara. Go back to that apartment of yours." She was already turning to leave, not for herself, but for Lily. Then the private elevator opened. Leonard Sterling, chairman, 72 years old, 4 decades at the top of this company, walked out. He didn't look at Martin. He walked directly to Clara, took her hand gently, and said quietly enough to be intimate, loudly enough for every person in that lobby to hear, "Clara, you finally came back." The room went still. Martin's face drained of color, and what he didn't know yet, what was about to be laid bare in front of everyone, was exactly why Leonard Sterling had been looking for this woman for years. If you've ever been told you don't belong somewhere, you know you should stay with this story. And if it means something to you, we'd love for you to subscribe. There's more where this came from. The morning had started the way most mornings did for the two of them. Clara stood at the small work table she had pushed against the window of their rented apartment, one hand holding a pencil, the other wrapped around a cup of coffee that had gone cold an hour ago. On the table were hand-drawn sketches, soft, deliberate lines mapping out the old Charleston waterfront timber warehouses, a wooden pier, a public walking path that curved along the water's edge, a small open market facing the sea. She drew from memory. The original was still in the drawer. She had completed that first design 9 years ago, when she was still a practicing interior architect, with enough dreams and enough conviction that beautiful spaces didn't have to cost a fortune to enter. Back then, she believed that the best thing a building could do was make a person feel welcome before they even stepped inside. Lily sat cross-legged in the corner, cutting shapes from colored paper, occasionally looking up. "Mom," she said, "is the place you're drawing somewhere everyone can go?" Clara smiled without looking up. "That's the whole point, baby." That was what the outside world saw when it looked at Clara Hayes, a single mother in her mid-30s living in a 2-bedroom rental in Charleston, running a small design studio out of her home, taking whatever projects came her way enough to cover rent enough to keep the refrigerator from being empty. No car, no business cards with embossed lettering, no name on any list that mattered. But if someone had looked more carefully at the drawings on her table, at the way Lily used words like proportion and negative space the way other children used big and small, they would have understood that Clara was not merely surviving the years since her divorce. She was quietly, methodically rebuilding herself. Leonard Sterling existed in Clara's life only as a detail she had once mentioned to her neighbor. "Years ago, someone sent me a handwritten thank you note for a waterfront proposal I submitted. He wrote by hand, didn't type it. I never knew his name." That man was Leonard, 72 years old, 4 decades running Sterling Dominion. The kind of man who had stood at the top of enough rooms to stop being impressed by them, and who had kept all those years the habit of writing by hand to people he considered worth the trouble. Everyone at Sterling Dominion knew that Leonard did not appear in the main lobby unless something genuinely mattered to him. Not to the shareholders, not to the press, to him. What nobody knew, not even the board members who had worked beside him for 20 years, was that Leonard had never fully let go of that waterfront proposal. He had kept a copy in a personal file in his home office. Not because he was certain something was wrong, but because something had always felt unresolved. And men who run companies for 4 decades learn to pay attention to things that feel unresolved. Martin Vale was introduced not through description, but through memory. A brief flash, Clara sitting on the floor of a half-empty room surrounded by cardboard boxes the afternoon of the day she signed the divorce papers. Martin standing in the doorway, not shouting, not angry, because men like Martin Vale had long stopped needing to shout. He looked at her and said, with the quiet certainty of someone who had already decided the outcome, "You should be grateful I didn't take more." That was the sentence she had carried with her for 3 years. Not because it was the cruelest thing he had ever said, but because for a long time she had almost believed it. The phone rang mid-morning. A young voice clearly rattled an administrative assistant from Sterling Dominion. The original design file for the waterfront project had gone missing from the internal archive. The closing presentation was scheduled for that afternoon. The caller didn't know why Clara's name was attached to the old records. He only knew it was. Clara set the phone down and stood still for a moment. She knew that file. She had drawn every line in it. She looked across the room. Lily had fallen asleep on the small couch, colored paper scattered around her. No time to arrange childcare. No other option. "Hey," Clara said softly, touching her daughter's shoulder. "Get your shoes on. We're just dropping something off. Then we come straight home." The folder sat on the passenger seat of the rideshare. The entire drive downtown. Clara's hand resting on top of it, the way you rest a hand on something you're not sure you should have brought. She had told herself it was simple. Walk in. Hand it to the front desk. Walk out. She was not there to make a scene. She was not there to confront anyone. She was there because 9 years ago she had drawn something she believed in, and she was not willing to let it disappear into a filing error on the day it mattered most. The truth was quieter and harder to name. The waterfront had been her idea before it was anyone else's. The open walkway, the preserved warehouses, the free community space, the market stalls for working families, none of that had come from a boardroom. It had come from her sitting at a drafting table in the apartment she and Martin shared before she understood what kind of man she had married. She owed Martin nothing. She owed Sterling Dominion nothing. But she owed that waterfront something she couldn't quite let go of. The lobby of Sterling Dominion hit her the moment the glass doors slid open, cool air, high ceilings, the low murmur of important conversations happening at a register designed to signal importance. Lily moved closer, fingers curling around the hem of Clara's coat. "It's loud," Lily whispered. "I know," Clara said. "We won't be long." She kept her eyes on the reception desk across the lobby. 30 feet, maybe less. She just needed to reach it. She didn't. Martin appeared from the left, not by accident. Someone in the building had flagged her name at the entrance. He walked out of a cluster of investors and board members with the unhurried confidence of a man who had never once in his adult life been caught off guard in public. He positioned himself directly in her path. He did not lower his voice. "Clara." The way he said her name, flat, almost bored, was its own kind of dismissal. "What exactly are you doing here?" "I have documents the office needs. I was asked to bring them." "You could have left them with security." He glanced at Lily, then back at Clara, the look lasting just long enough to make its point. "You didn't need to come in person." Around them, conversations had stilled. A photographer from a financial press outlet lowered his camera slightly, then raised it again. Several board members had turned. Martin let the silence sit for a moment. He was good at silences, then continued louder now, his voice carrying the ease of someone who has never had to worry about who is listening. "You don't belong here anymore, Clara. You haven't for a long time. Leave the file at the desk and go home. Lily's hand found Clara's. Small fingers, tight grip. Clara looked at her daughter. Set the folder down on the nearest surface, a side table near the elevator bank, and reached for Lily's hand. She was not going to give Martin the satisfaction of a response. She was not going to let Lily stand in the middle of whatever this was about to become. She turned toward the exit. The private elevator opened. Leonard Sterling walked out alone. No assistant, no entourage. Just the man himself, 72 years old, silver-haired, wearing a dark navy tie that looked like something he had owned for 20 years and simply refused to replace. He did not scan the room the way powerful men often did when they entered a space. He walked with the unhurried certainty of someone who had already decided before the elevator doors opened exactly where he was going. He walked to Clara. He stopped in front of her, and without a word to Martin, without a nod to the investors standing 6 feet away, he reached out and took her hand. Not a handshake. Just a hand held the way you hold the hand of someone you have been waiting a long time to see. "Clara," he said. Quiet, certain. "You finally came back." The lobby went silent in the way that rooms go silent when something happens that no one had prepared for. Martin did not move. The color had left his face in the particular way that belongs to men who have spent years constructing a version of events and have just watched someone walk into the room who remembers the original. Clara stood very still. She was aware of Lily beside her, aware of the cameras, aware of the 30 or 40 people who had just watched the chairman of Sterling Dominion cross his own lobby to take the hand of a woman her ex-husband had 60 seconds ago told to leave. "Mr. Sterling," she said carefully, "I only came to drop off the design file. I know why you came," Leonard said, "and I know it wasn't for me." There was something almost gentle in the way he said it, not condescending, but honest. "Come upstairs. There are people who need to hear what you have to say." "I don't think that's Clara." He said her name the way people say the name of someone they are not asking to agree, only asking to trust. "I wrote you a letter 9 years ago, by hand. You never wrote back. I always wondered if you received it, or if it was stopped somewhere before it reached you." She had received it. She had read it 3 times, then put it in a drawer, because by the time it arrived, Martin had already told her the submission had been rejected, and her name had never been formally attached to anything. She had assumed the letter was a polite formality. She understood now it had been something else entirely. She looked at Lily. The choice in front of her was not complicated, but it was not simple either. She could take her daughter's hand and walk out the door, keep the life she had rebuilt quiet and small and genuinely hers. Martin would win. The waterfront would become what he had made it, and the design she had drawn at 27 would be buried permanently under someone else's name. Or she could stay. Lily looked up at her. Not afraid. Just watching the way children watch when they are trying to understand what kind of person their mother is going to be in a moment that counts. Clara turned back to Leonard. "All right," she said, "but she comes with me." Leonard looked at Lily and smiled briefly, genuinely. "Of course she does." The conference room on the 14th floor was all glass and gray steel, the kind of room designed to make every conversation feel like a negotiation. Leonard sat at the head of the table. Clara sat to his right. 3 board members were present, along with 2 senior staff members, whose expressions suggested they had been briefed on very little and were working hard to appear otherwise. Martin sat across from Clara. He had recovered his composure on the elevator ride up. She had watched it happen, the slow reassembly of his confidence, the way his shoulders had dropped back into their customary position of controlled authority. By the time the doors opened on 14, he was once again the man who always knew which room he was walking into. Leonard spoke first. He did not use notes. He told the room that 9 years ago, Sterling Dominion had received an unsolicited design proposal for the waterfront project. It was not the most polished submission they had received that year, but it was the only one that had opened with a question rather than a revenue projection. Who gets to stand at the water's edge? He said he had written a personal letter to the designer. He said her name was Clara Hayes, and he said that shortly after her name had disappeared entirely from the internal records associated with that project. He did not accuse anyone directly. He simply stated what he knew and what he had quietly begun to verify in the weeks before Clara had ever walked through the door. Martin let a few seconds pass before he responded. "With respect," Martin said, his voice measured and reasonable in the way that made unreasonable things sound like common sense. "Clara was my wife at the time. She contributed informally the way spouses sometimes do when they're close to a project. That's not the same as professional authorship." He looked at the board members, not at Clara. "We're talking about a $100 million development. I don't think it serves anyone to let personal history cloud a decision of this scale." He let that land, then added quietly, almost as an aside. "And given everything Clara has been through since the divorce, I'd want to be careful about placing her in a high-pressure environment. For her sake." The "for her sake" did the work Martin intended it to do. Two of the board members exchanged a glance. Clara felt the shape of the trap. If she pushed back now, she would look reactive, the unstable ex-wife Martin had just painted her as. If she said nothing, she would watch her own work be dismissed in real time by the man who had taken it from her. She took a breath and spoke directly to the board. "I have the original file with me. Hand-drawn preliminary sketches, typed design rationale, and a materials breakdown, all dated. I also have the letter Mr. Sterling sent me, which confirms he was aware of my name and my involvement before the project entered its development phase." She placed the folder on the table. "I'm not here to relitigate my marriage. I'm here because the design this project was built on was mine, and I'd like the chance to make sure it's built correctly." Silence. Leonard reached across and opened the folder. He looked at the first page for a long moment, then looked up at the board. "I'd like Clara to serve as creative director on this project, reporting directly to me," he said. "Effective immediately." Martin's expression did not change, but his hand resting on the table closed slowly into a fist. The first 2 weeks, Clara worked quietly. She came in early before most of the floor had arrived, made her own coffee in the small kitchen down the hall, and spread her materials across the work table in the office. Leonard had arranged for her a modest room on the 11th floor with a window that faced the harbor. On clear mornings, she could see the waterfront from where she sat. The cranes, the old warehouse roof lines, the strip of water that caught the light differently depending on the hour. She requested access to the current project files. It took 3 days and 2 separate approvals to get them. When she finally opened them, she sat without moving for a long time. The waterfront in her original design had been built around a single organizing principle, that public space should feel like it belongs to the public. The timber warehouses preserved and converted into a community hall, a free walking path along the water's edge, an open market with affordable stall fees for local vendors, a small performance area, no gates, no membership tiers, no separate entrance for anyone. What was in the current files looked nothing like that. Glass towers, an underground parking structure, a perimeter fence with keycard access, a high-end retail corridor, 2 boutique hotel floors, a rooftop restaurant accessible only to residents and registered guests. The walking path still existed, but it had been rerouted. It now ran behind the main structure, Narrow, poorly lit, technically public, but positioned in every practical sense to discourage use. Clara pinned her original sketches to the wall beside printed pages from the current plan and looked at them for the better part of an hour. Then she picked up her pencil and started over. On those late evenings when she worked past 7, she would call home and listen to Lily narrate the homework she had finished and the dinner she had made herself, cereal, usually with methodical justifications for why cereal counted as a complete meal. It was the sound of those phone calls that kept the work from feeling like a crusade, and kept it feeling like what it actually was, something she was doing, so that the world Lily grew up in would have at least one more door in it that opened for everyone. The first direct confrontation with Martin happened in a small internal review meeting, 4 people, a projector, and no pretense of civility once the door was closed. Martin presented the current design with the ease of someone who had presented it many times before and expected the same result. When Clara raised her objections, the rerouted path, the access restrictions, the elimination of the community hall, Martin listened with the expression of a man humoring someone he had already decided was wrong. The original concept was idealistic, he said when she finished. The market research doesn't support an open access model at this location. The investors need a return. People who can't afford to shop there still live 2 blocks away, Clara said. They watched this waterfront get fenced off. You're not just building a development. You're sending a message about who the city thinks deserves to look at the water. Martin's expression shifted into something worse than anger. Patience. People without money don't generate returns, he said simply. That's not a moral position, it's arithmetic. Clara had heard that sentence before. Not in those words, but in that structure. The same logic applied to her ideas, her work, her judgment across 7 years of marriage, in which she had slowly learned to call her own instincts naive. Every time she had proposed something he considered impractical, Martin had a version of that sentence ready. And for a long time she had believed him. She didn't believe him now. Then we have a different definition of what this project is for, she said. And I think that difference matters enough to bring to Leonard. Martin looked at her the way he had looked at her across that boardroom table with the calm of someone who was certain he would win. Of course you do, he said. But Leonard was sitting at the end of the table, and he had not nodded along with Martin's arithmetic. He had been watching Clara. And when she stood her ground, without raising her voice, Leonard set down his pen. Martin noticed. And Clara, for the first time in longer than she could remember, did not shrink. Martin understood by the end of that meeting that Clara was not going to be managed. He had tried diminishing her credentials, framing her involvement as sentimental interference, positioning himself as the voice of reason against her idealism. It hadn't worked. Leonard was listening to her too carefully, and the board members who had exchanged skeptical glances in the first meeting were now asking Clara questions instead of deferring automatically to Martin. So he changed his method. He stopped attacking Clara directly. Instead, he attacked what she couldn't afford to lose. The first move was a story that appeared in a financial trade publication 10 days after the review meeting. It didn't name Clara explicitly, but it described in enough detail for anyone who knew the situation to recognize it, a single mother with no active professional standing who had inserted herself into a major development project through a personal connection to the chairman, disrupting a process that had been carefully managed for 2 years. Clara read it on her phone while waiting for Lily's school bus. She read it twice. Then she put her phone in her pocket and stood very still on the sidewalk until the bus came. The second move arrived by certified mail 3 days later. A letter from Martin's attorney. A formal request to the family court to review the existing custody arrangement for Lily, citing concerns about the mother's financial instability, irregular work schedule, and the phrase that made Clara sit down at the kitchen table and not get up for 20 minutes, potential psychological stress affecting the home environment. Martin came to the apartment that evening without calling ahead. Clara opened the door, and he stepped inside before she could decide whether to let him. He looked around the apartment, the way he always had, not with contempt exactly, but with the gaze of a man accustomed to measuring the value of spaces and finding them adequate or inadequate according to his own scale. He sat down at the kitchen table. Clara remained standing. "I'm not here to fight," he said. His voice was even, almost kind. "I'm here because I think you're making a mistake, and I'd rather tell you that directly." "Say what you came to say, Martin." He looked toward the hallway that led to Lily's room. "She's settled here. She's doing well in school. You've built something stable for her, and I respect that." He paused. "Don't destabilize it chasing something that isn't going to end the way you think it is." "That's a threat," Clara said. "It's an observation," Martin said. He stood and moved toward the door. Then with his hand on the frame, he turned back. "You were always talented, Clara. I never said otherwise. But there's a difference between talent and belonging. And you've always had trouble knowing which rooms you actually have a right to walk into." He left. Clara stood in the kitchen for a long time after the door closed. Then she went to the desk in the corner of the living room and opened the bottom drawer. Inside, beneath a folder of Lily's old drawings, was a manila envelope. Inside the envelope were printed emails from 9 years ago. Internal communications from Sterling Dominion's design coordination team copied to Martin, in which he had explicitly instructed staff to remove the original designer's name from project documentation and attribute the preliminary concept work to the in-house team. She had saved them without knowing why. The way you save things you hope you'll never need. She laid them on the desk, smoothed the pages flat. Using them meant going to war openly formally, in a proceeding where Lily's name would also appear. It meant committing fully to a fight she had spent 3 years trying to stay out of. She looked at the pages for a long time. Then she went to check on Lily, who had fallen asleep with her arms stretched out across the pillow, the way she always slept when she was unbothered. The emergency board meeting was called for a Thursday morning. Martin had requested it. The agenda distributed the night before listed 3 items: a review of project timeline disruptions, an assessment of external communications risk, and listed third, plainly as though it were administrative, a formal recommendation to terminate Clara Hayes' consulting engagement effective immediately. Clara received the agenda by email at 11 o'clock at night. She sat at the kitchen table and read it 3 times. Attached to the same email thread forwarded by a junior staff member who Clara suspected had done so at some personal risk was a copy of the family court filing. The hearing was scheduled for the following month. The filing cited, among other things, the quote that had appeared in the trade publication, the one Martin had planted as evidence of a pattern of erratic professional behavior inconsistent with a stable home environment. He had used his own leak as a legal document. Clara closed her laptop. The apartment was quiet. Lily was asleep. The original sketches were still pinned to the corkboard above the desk. She thought about walking away. She had built something here. Small, yes. Precarious, yes. But genuinely hers. If she withdrew from the project quietly, the waterfront would become what Martin had designed it to be, and her name would remain where he had put it nowhere. But Lily would be safe. She sat with that option for a long time. Then she went into Lily's room and stood in the doorway. Lily was half awake. She often woke briefly around this hour. She looked up at her mother in the low light and said in the slow voice of someone not entirely back from sleep, "Mom, if you don't belong there, then who's going to build the places for people like us?" She was asleep again before Clara could answer. Clara stood in the doorway for another minute. Then she went back to the kitchen table, opened her laptop, and wrote a single email to Leonard Sterling. It was 4 sentences long. I'll be at the board meeting tomorrow. I have documentation I'd like to present before the agenda proceeds. I'm not asking for extra time, 15 minutes will be enough. I think you'll want to hear this before the vote. She sent it at 11:47 p.m. Leonard's reply came at 12:03 a.m., 2 sentences. I'll be there early. So will you. The board meeting began at 9. By 8:40, Clara was already in the building. She had not brought Lily. Her neighbor had agreed without being asked for a reason to walk Lily to school. Clara had packed the manila envelope, the original design file, the handwritten notes from the early project meetings, and Leonard's letter, the one written by hand 9 years ago, still in its original envelope. She sat in a chair outside the boardroom and waited. Martin arrived at 8:55 with his attorney and 2 senior staff members. He saw Clara in the hallway. He did not stop walking, but he slowed just slightly and looked at her with an expression she recognized. The expression of a man who had already counted his winnings. She looked back at him without looking away. Inside the boardroom, Martin stood before the assembled board and spoke with the composure of someone delivering a verdict rather than an argument. His points were organized. His voice was level. And at the end, he said the thing he had been building toward since the morning in the lobby. Clara Hayes has never belonged at Sterling Dominion. She has never belonged in rooms like this one. And she should not be given the authority to make decisions about a $100 million project based on the personal sympathies of one board member. The room waited. The door opened. Leonard Sterling walked in. Leonard did not sit down. That was the first thing the room noticed. There were 11 people at the table, including Martin and his attorney, and the chairman's chair sat empty at the head, while Leonard stood beside it, one hand resting on the back, looking at the board with the expression of a man who had made a decision before he walked through the door. Before we proceed with the agenda, he said, I need to share some information with this board. Information I should have acted on sooner. Martin's attorney leaned in and said something quietly to his client. Martin shook his head almost imperceptibly. He was still composed. He had prepared for Leonard to defend Clara. An old man's loyalty to an interesting woman was not he had decided enough to override a board of 11 people looking at a $100 million timeline. What he had not factored in was the folder Leonard placed on the table. When Clara Hayes walked into this building several weeks ago, Leonard said, I recognized her name immediately. I had written her a personal letter 9 years ago regarding a waterfront design proposal. I was troubled for years by the feeling that something about how that proposal was handled was not right. I did not act on that feeling then. I am acting on it now. He opened the folder. The first document was an internal email chain dated 8 years and 9 months ago. The sender was Martin Vale. The instruction written in Martin's own measured prose was explicit. The preliminary concept. Documentation was to be restructured, the original designer's name removed from all project-facing materials, and the concept work attributed to the in-house team for the purposes of client presentation. The second document was a follow-up 2 weeks later, confirming the instruction had been carried out. The third was Leonard's handwritten letter to Clara, the original in its envelope alongside a photocopy of the submission log that confirmed her name had appeared in the system before Martin's instruction and had not appeared after it. Leonard set the documents down and looked at the board. This is not a question of personal sympathy, he said. Martin's word turned back on him. This is a question of what actually happened and what this company put its name on. The room was very quiet. Clara sat to Leonard's left. She had not spoken. She had placed her own folder on the table, the original sketches, the dated notes, the handwritten meeting records, but she had not opened it because it turned out she didn't need to. Leonard had conducted his own quiet investigation long before she had sent that late-night email. He had been waiting not for her to bring him evidence, but for her to decide she was ready to use it. Martin spoke. His voice was still controlled, but something underneath it had shifted. "These documents are being taken out of context," he said. "The restructuring of project attribution was a standard internal process approved through the appropriate channels. What's being characterized as misconduct was Martin." Leonard said his name the way he had said Clara's in the lobby, quiet, certain, final. "I ran this company for 40 years by understanding the difference between a process and a cover. What I'm looking at is a cover." Martin stopped talking. One of the board members, a woman in her 60s who had said very little in any of the previous meetings, reached across the table and pulled the email chain toward her. She read it without expression. Then she set it down and looked at Martin in a way that did not require words. Clara looked at the documents spread across the table. Her work, her name, her 9 years, and felt something she had not expected to feel in this room. Not triumph, not relief. Just the quiet, unfamiliar weight of being seen accurately by people who had the power to say so out loud. Martin was placed on administrative suspension before the meeting adjourned. The motion was made by the board member who had pulled the email chain across the table. It was seconded within seconds. The investigation would follow proper channels. Everything would be documented. But Martin Vale would not be present in any Sterling Dominion decision-making capacity while that investigation was underway. Martin stood when the motion passed. He straightened his jacket, the automatic composure of a man reaching for a reset that was no longer available to him. He looked at his attorney, and then he walked out. The door closed behind him without drama. No raised voices. No final statement. Just a door closing. The board spent the following hour working through the practical implications. Clara's name would be formally restored to all original project documentation. Leonard proposed that Clara be appointed Community Design Director, not as a consultant, not in an advisory capacity, but as the lead creative authority with final say on all design decisions affecting public access and community use. Before she signed anything, Clara spoke. "I have one condition. The design goes back to the original concept. The public walkway, the community hall, the open market, no perimeter fencing, no membership access, no separate entrance for anyone." She looked at the board evenly. "If that's not something this board is willing to commit to, I'll leave today without a grievance. But I won't put my name on what it was becoming." The board voted. 8 in favor, 2 abstentions, 1 absence. Clara nodded once and picked up her pen. On her way out of the building, she passed the hallway where Martin's office was located. The door was open. A junior staff member was inside collecting files under the supervision of an HR representative. The desk was already cleared of the personal items, the framed citations, the small bronze plaque engraved with a quote about leadership that Martin had chosen himself. Clara did not stop, but she slowed just slightly and looked in. She had spent a long time being afraid of that man. Not of his voice or his presence, but of the version of herself she became when she was near him, smaller, quieter, more willing to believe that her instincts were wrong and his certainty was right. Standing in that hallway, she felt none of it. She kept walking. She called Leonard that evening after Lily was in bed. "The custody filing," she said. "Will it?" "My legal team contacted the court this afternoon," Leonard said. "Martin's attorney advised him to withdraw it. It's done." A pause. "Clara, are you all right?" She thought about that for a moment. "I think so," she said. I think I will be. Good, Leonard said. And then after a brief silence, I owe you an apology. 9 years ago, I had a feeling something wasn't right with how your proposal was handled. I wrote you a letter, and then I let it go. I should have looked more closely. You didn't know for certain, Clara said. No, he said. But I suspected, and I chose not to push. That's not the same as not knowing, and I've thought about it more than you'd expect. She didn't have an answer for that. She appreciated that he hadn't asked her for one. After she hung up, she went to the corkboard above the desk. She unpinned the current project plan, the glass towers, the fenced perimeter, the rerouted path, and set it aside. The original sketches stayed on the wall. Chapton. The Charleston Waterfront Commons opened on a Saturday morning in May, 14 months later. The weather was the kind that made people feel the city had arranged it on purpose, warm without being heavy. A steady breeze off the water carrying the smell of salt and something faintly wooden from the restored warehouse beams. By the time the ribbon cutting was scheduled to begin at 10, the open market stalls had already been occupied for 2 hours. A local bakery had sold out of its first batch. A teenager was playing guitar near the community hall entrance, his case open on the ground, and people were stopping, just stopping, without being asked to buy anything. Clara stood to the side of the small stage and watched the crowd fill in. She recognized faces, the contractor who had pushed back on the perimeter fencing redesign, and then once convinced, had become its most committed advocate. The city planner who had cried briefly and without apology when she saw the final community hall layout. 2 women from the neighborhood 2 blocks east who had attended every public comment meeting and had never once believed they told Clara afterward that anyone was actually listening. Leonard introduced her from the stage without the prepared remarks his communications team had sent him the night before. He folded the paper and put it in his jacket pocket and spoke without it. He said that Sterling Dominion had made mistakes on this project. He said that the original vision for the waterfront had belonged to a designer named Clara Hayes, that her name had been removed from the record without her knowledge, and that the company was correcting it today not as a gesture, but as a fact. Then he said, "Clara." She walked up. The crowd was larger than she had expected, not just investors and city officials and press, but residents. People who had seen the construction and wondered what it would become, people who had attended the public sessions, people who had simply walked down on a Saturday morning because the gates were open and there was no sign telling them they needed a reason. She looked out at them and set aside what she had prepared to say. For a long time, she said, I believed what someone told me, that I didn't belong in rooms where decisions like this one get made. She paused. It took me longer than it should have to understand that the people who get pushed out of those rooms are sometimes exactly the people who know what's missing from them. She didn't say Martin's name. She didn't need to. This place was designed for the people who live here, not for the people who can afford a membership. Not for the people who get a separate entrance, for the people who live 2 blocks away and have been watching this waterfront sit behind a construction fence for 4 years. She looked out at the crowd. You should have always been able to walk down to the water. I'm sorry it took this long. Afterward, Clara and Lily walked through the main entrance together. The bronze plaque was mounted at eye level beside the door. Simple lettering. No flourish. Lead designer Clara Hayes. Lily read it, then looked up at her mother, then looked back at the plaque with the particular expression she wore when she was filing something away for later, not just understanding it, but keeping it. Mom, she said, as they walked through into the open space beyond the water, visible at the end of the path, catching the morning light. Can we build more places like this one? Clara took her daughter's hand. Yes, she said. And this time we'll make sure our name stays on it. Leonard watched them from the edge of the stage. He did not follow. He simply stood and watched the crowd move through the entrance, families, elderly couples, a group of teenagers who had arrived on bicycles and locked them to the rack near the market stalls as though they had always known it would be there. He reached into his jacket pocket and felt the folded paper of the remarks he hadn't used. Then he put it back and watched the city walk in. Clara's story isn't really about a waterfront. It's about what happens when someone spends years being told they're too small for the room and finally decides to stop believing it. The people who get pushed out of the door are sometimes the only ones who understand how the door should have been built in the first place. Your work doesn't disappear just because someone removed your name from it. Your value doesn't depend on who's willing to acknowledge it in a given room on a given day. And belonging isn't something another person gets to grant or take away. It's something you walk back into on your own terms when you're ready. If this story stayed with you, consider subscribing. Every week we bring you stories about people who were counted out and what happened when they stopped counting themselves out too. We'd love to have you with us.